Hi everyone, thanks for joining the Gatsby webinar today. We will get started in just 1 minute. Again, thanks to everyone for joining the webinar. We'll get started in just a minute or so. Okay, we're going to get started. I want to take a minute to welcome everybody to this Gatsby webinar. The webinar is This Changes Everything, Incremental Builds in Gatsby. So we're glad that you can join us today. And a couple of reminders as we get started. The first is that everyone will be on mute, but we do want people to submit questions. So there is a question window in the GoToWebinar interface. So please, as we're going through the webinar and Dustin is presenting, feel free to submit your questions in that interface, and we'll have plenty of time at the end of the presentation to get to them. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dustin Schau, who is head of product at Gatsby. And Dustin leads the product team in creating compelling experiences for our users. He also helps our customers tackle big technical challenges. And he's very passionate about all things JavaScript and Gatsby. Quick reminders, if you want to chat about this on Twitter, our Twitter handle is GatsbyJS. So we'll also be monitoring the Twitter handle if comments come up there. We do have live captions, and they can be viewed at, the short link is gatsby.dev/captions. And I also put the link directly in the chat window. So if you just want to go to the chat window, you can find the link to live captions there. And everyone who's on time gets the reward of being part of our first poll. So we have one polling question that we'd like you to answer to get started. And I'm going to launch that now. So you should see a screen come up. And the question is, are incremental builds in Gatsby Cloud the same as other platforms? So you can choose yes, no, yes, but actually no, or you may have no idea. So go ahead and cast your vote. I see over 50% have voted. We'll give you just a few more seconds before I close the poll and share the results. And don't worry, we will definitely get to answering this question in Dustin's presentation. I'm going to close the poll now and see what people have voted. Okay, so a lot of people have no idea, which is great. This is why you're here. We're going to make sure we answer this question for you in Dustin's presentation. So now I am going to turn it over to Dustin and make him the presenter.
Awesome, thanks, Linda. All right, first of all, welcome everyone. Glad to be here again, talking about something near and dear to my heart, Gatsby, and specifically incremental builds and Gatsby Cloud. So my goal today is to first, whether you have context around what Gatsby is or not, just kind of start around what Gatsby is, why it matters, how Gatsby isn't just a static site generator, and then I'll go into how incremental builds is really kind of like a game-changing concept. You know, this changes everything. This unblocks new and novel use cases of using Gatsby, of using generally of the static compilation approach. And then I'll end with around 10 minutes of demos at the end, showing, not merely telling, you know, everything I'll be talking about today. So first of all, just another brief intro, as Linda mentioned. My name is Dustin Schau, head of product at Gatsby. Started at Gatsby as an engineer on the open source team, And so still actively and always working closely with the open source team, but also doing some great work with our cloud product, particularly incremental builds today. So I live in Mountain View, new-ish to the Bay Area, moved here less than a year ago. So Bay Area noob. And my fun fact isn't really a fun fact about me, but I am engaged to a triplet. So that's Maggie and myself in Munich a few years ago. And I'll show a little bit of this in a demo at the end. So ultimately, like, why am I here today? Like, what's the agenda? What am I hoping to achieve with this? So I hope you leave with a few things today. One, I hope you leave with an understanding of what incremental builds means for the types of applications that you can build with Gatsby now. Basically, what incremental builds as a concept, as this evolutionary, or as this revolutionary, not merely evolutionary concept, is able to kind of unblock, and the types of sites that can be built. I'd also like you to leave with a greater understanding of what Gatsby is, and also what it isn't. And then finally, I'd like you to leave with, my hope is that you build your next site with Gatsby, you deploy your next site with Gatsby Cloud, and you do so incrementally. So what is Gatsby? Here's kind of the reasonably pithy, one-liner. Gatsby is an open source web framework for generating performant, scalable, and secure websites and apps with React. So oftentimes when people think of Gatsby, or when people talk about Gatsby, they say kind of like euphemistically, like, Gatsby is quote unquote just a static site generator. And while that is true, Gatsby does produce static assets, I think of it more in the lens of this. Gatsby is a framework on top of these great tools like React, tools like GraphQL, Node to build and deploy. And so I think of it more as a framework, as an application compiler that really is like a shortcut to building out an excellent, fast, performant application for your end users. So one of the key things here is that when people say Gatsby is just a static site generator, they're basically saying, Gatsby isn't useful for apps. Gatsby is just useful for instance, marketing sites or landing pages. And that couldn't be further from the truth. As I see it, Gatsby is for content sites, so sites with lots of content powered by a CMS, and full-blown applications. And let's go into the why of this. So it's kind of like do some logical exercises here. Gatsby enables you to build with React. This is why people like Gatsby. It's a thriving ecosystem. You can pull components off the shelf. You may have like an internal design system or component library, and by virtue of being in this React space, you can build out your application with these primitives, with these building blocks really, really quickly and really, really easily. Ultimately, Gatsby leverages React. Apps can be built with React. You see tons and tons more every day. React's kind of like eating the web, like the way Gatsby's eating the web. So apps can be built with React. Therefore, Gatsby can be used for apps. Not really a huge stretch of logic here. React is useful for building applications. Gatsby produces a React application. So therefore, Gatsby can be used for apps. So while Gatsby does statically optimize assets, and I will contend you should statically optimize your assets when you can, it also produces a client-side application that's fully dynamic, that can do things like make API calls, it can do dynamic interactions, it can fetch comments. You can really do whatever you want with the Gatsby application by virtue of it being in the React space, by being a React application. And so the key takeaway here is that producing static assets is not the same as being a static application. And so while Gatsby does produce static assets, again, what you produce, what is bundled to your end user, is a regular React application. I kind of analogize it sometimes to like Gatsby produces Create React App. So it's producing like the React, what Create React App produces, namely a React application, but it's optimizing what can be optimized. And so that's where I see some of the key values of Gatsby as a tool. So when I said it produces static assets, like, why does that matter? And so Gatsby produces static assets that can be deployed globally, simply, scalably, and securely. I kind of think of it as S3. Most people are familiar with Amazon's S3. And so this is kind of the S3 that I think of with Gatsby. Static assets are the way that I think the web should be built. They're simpler. There's less cause for concern. There's less cause for outages. They're more scalable. So you can dump this bucket of content, put a CDN in front of it, and that thing effectively scales infinitely for very, very cheap. And they're secure. When you decouple your CMS from hosting, when you're not using WordPress or Drupal for hosting, and you're just using them for what they're good at, namely managing content, you solve a whole host of security issues, and you and your users and your developers will thank you for producing static assets and using a tool like Gatsby. So a little workflow diagram is helpful to kind of like contextualize this. Here's what Gatsby does. It takes data sources, it runs a build process where these data sources are stitched together via GraphQL. This stitching together and this ahead of time compilation, this build process, will then produce static assets, namely HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images. These will all be optimized, again, by virtue of Gatsby being a web framework, kind of like an optimizing compiler. And then this build process, which produces static assets, these static assets can be hosted simply, securely, and scalably with the CDN of your choice. So this is, as a concept, why I think Gatsby is so compelling and why I build all my applications and why I think all your applications should be built statically with Gatsby. And so my contention here is that the web should be built with static assets that are built ahead of time. And so if you are, if you're not doing this, you're imposing a runtime cost, you're putting a server in front of your user when you really don't need to. And oftentimes an application is more static than you may realize. So the mental model I hold for Gatsby is compile, optimize, build ahead of time for what can and should be built ahead of time, and your end users will thank you. So when you think of this, like what does this actually enable, like going static? It's really several key wins. So performance, SEO, security, simplicity, of course, but what goes down is costs. We've heard anecdotally that in the factor of like several thousands of dollars, sometimes even like hundreds of thousands of dollars of using like a non-decoupled server-oriented approach, like using WordPress or Drupal for hosting. Your costs skyrocket. You're using a CMS for hosting when what a CMS is designed for is managing content, and you're doing so in a way that's not scalable. If you have a nice viral release, like it's going to cause a lot of heartburn. And ultimately, when you go static, what goes down is pain. I think that there are lots of complexities and complexifiers with going fully dynamic or going fully server-side rendered, and by decoupling, by letting the content management system, by letting your data exist as data, and then by using Gatsby as the view layer, as the rendering engine, and then producing static assets, whole hosts of issues go away. You and your team can sleep better at night. And ultimately, again, I think this is the way the web should be built. However, historically, ahead of time building, quote unquote, static generation doesn't scale. We'd oftentimes hear that, well, hey, what if I want to build out WordPress, or what if I want to build out, Twitter, or something where, there's rapid content edits, there's rapid amount of changes. I can't build out this entire application, when any single thing changes, because that burdensome build process, that 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 minute build process, I just can't stomach that cost. So I'll go fully dynamic because this isn't a supported use case with tools like Gatsby today. And to be totally frank, this is true. This is where we were at, and this is why I'm excited for where we're going. And so this general notion, this notion of, well, what if I have rapid data updates, or what if I have, like a fairly large content model? What this leads to is that people go entirely dynamic, notably server-side rendered at runtime. And so this kind of seemingly necessary condition, has been true. And so it leads people to like fully discount a solution like Gatsby or static rendering. It doesn't really need to be discounted, as you'll soon see. And so the why of this, ultimately, you're doing your users a disservice if you're going fully dynamic. You're passing that API cost, that burden of fetching data to kind of keep it live and hydrated on each and every request. So for instance, classic model, you publish a new blog post. That blog post, when rendered to your user, is going to be an API call that you're passing to your user. That page is going to take longer to respond. It's going to take longer to render, and you're passing that cost to the user when that cost could be better paid on the server by doing ahead of time compilation. And it ultimately, this key takeaway, doesn't have to be this way. And let me tell you why. So incremental builds. Incremental builds is a feature that we launched a few weeks ago. We've been actively working on it for, honestly, several years, and I'm super excited to talk through what incremental builds means for you, what it means for your users, and why it matters as a concept. So first, I wanted to clarify some terms because honestly, words are hard. So what is an incremental build? An incremental build is a build that upon a data change, basically upon some change in the state of the external world, a source in Gatsby terms, we are going to just build out the minimal amount of pages that need to be built to render our application consistent. And by virtue of doing less work, by virtue of knowing this data model and understanding what needs to change, because Gatsby owns this data model, we can then render only the pages that need to be re-rendered, build them, and then publish them to a CDN with incremental builds. Incremental builds are only available in Gatsby Cloud and work best in Gatsby Cloud. So why do incremental builds matter? Ultimately, it's really one key reason, and that reason is because speed matters. So before incremental builds, what kind of the state of the world was is that upon any type of change, you need to rebuild your entire site. So even if you're doing a typo fix or you have a late breaking news update, you're going to need to build out your entire application, not just that blog post and homepage, because incremental builds wasn't a concept that existed in this landscape. And so what that meant is that, if you have like a typo fix that needs to go live in a minute or in 10 seconds or in 20 seconds, you're waiting for the entire build. And this is really what caused people, I think, to go fully dynamic. And so with incremental builds, this trade-off between consistency and like eventual consistency is like ever driving to zero. And that's ultimately our goal. We want incremental builds as a concept to ultimately drive, to 1 second or even milliseconds, so that when you change content, when you change data, your site is available to your users around the globe as quickly as possible, because speed matters, because you want those updates out as quickly as possible so that you can beat your competitors and you can get those late breaking updates out as quickly as they should. And so ultimately, there's another key benefit. You just spend time building, not waiting for a build. And so when you think of deploy previews and opening up pull requests, with incremental builds, you spend less time waiting, and this enables you to spend more time building out your excellent web experience, not waiting for a build to complete so you know what this looks like. And so again, this is giving incremental builds as a concept is giving you and your developers time back so that you can focus on building out excellent experiences, not waiting for builds, watching the clock, counting the hours in the day. And again, let's not lose sight, your users need your content faster. You want to be, having the excellent tech stack that saves you money, that helps you sleep at night, but also that has a true end user impact on performance and getting things out there as quickly as possible. So, you want this workflow. Your marketing team and content team wants this workflow where they can edit a blog post, where they can edit a press release, where they can edit and add a new case study, they can fix a typo. All kinds of use cases where we need this content and we need this content updated more quickly. Your users want it, your content editors want it, and incremental builds enables it. And ultimately, it's because your time matters. Don't spend time waiting, spend time building, spend time focusing on your user, spend time focusing on making more money, and spend time building out excellent experiences. So as I kind of think of this model, and why incremental builds is so appealing as a concept, it's really this notion of push versus pull. And so I think a great analogy is you push to GitHub, you just push what changes. So for instance, if I'm pushing a file or a view file change, if my teammates are up to date, if my teammates have recently pulled, when they pull my changes, they're going to just pull the diff of what changed. They're just going to pull that file or two that was in that most recent pull request. And so this mental model of push versus pull is how I think of Gatsby Cloud and particularly incremental builds. So let's kind of tweak this metaphor and go a little bit further and make it kind of a little more concrete. So your content editors push, they publish to your CMS, and Gatsby Cloud pulls the updates, the diff, incrementally. And so what this basically means is this is very similar to how something like GitHub works is, keep pushing content, keep publishing content, and Gatsby Cloud will just pull the minimal amount of changes to get consistent, not the entire data model. And so this incremental data fetching, this push versus pull model is essential for true incremental builds. So we can kind of stretch this further because Gatsby is data agnostic. We talk a lot about CMSs, but our thriving source plugin ecosystem, data can come from anywhere. So data gets pushed, Gatsby pulls the changes incrementally. And so as I see it, and I don't want to overstate, but incremental builds to me are like really the holy grail for static sites. I talked a lot about the virtues of why the notion of going static matters so much, why ahead of time compiling and producing static assets is the way that the web should be built. And I think of incremental builds as the supercharger, this kind of like missing link that solves the like downside of going static. So in some ways, people will say, static optimization is great, but it doesn't work well for data updates, or static optimization is great, but I have a fairly heavy content model and I could never use it for like a news site or for something where I'm like updating content all the time. We're pushing hundreds of updates a day. And so incremental builds as a concept, by this virtue of diffing, by differential data fetching, and then by building out your application much more quickly, this solves these problems. And so now the pitch isn't Gatsby is great, but the pitch is Gatsby is great, full stop. Incremental builds as a concept changes the perception of what Gatsby can be used for, and I do really think it's the holy grail for static sites. So with incremental builds, what are the upsides here? So performance stays the same. You are just deploying the changes to your content model. So for instance, the 1, 2, 3, 4 HTML files, images, CSS, etc. There's no runtime cost to this whatsoever. And so your end user has the exact same experience as if it was a full build, but you're spending less time waiting for that full build because it's not a full build, it's an incremental build. Things like streaming data updates are totally possible. Sub 10-second builds are now the expectation, not the lofty holy grail standard that we wish we could have. This is what incremental builds enables. And then for sites that have rapid data changes, totally doable, totally possible, unblocked with incremental builds. Ultimately, by going static, by solving one of the major downsides of going static, this builds happiness. I talked about pain by going dynamic. The inverse is true with incremental builds and with Gatsby. I think this is the way the web should be built. Incremental builds solves one of the big downsides, and I think it's a very exciting time to be using Gatsby. So I don't just want to come and just merely talk about this as a concept. I do want to get a little bit into the weeds and talk through how does incremental builds actually work. You've talked about these terms like incremental data fetching, by incremental building, by diffing the content model. How does this behind the scenes actually work? So as many are aware, if you've used Gatsby, you've almost certainly used a source plugin. And so Gatsby's source plugin ecosystem is powered by GraphQL. And so what happens is that you use a source plugin. The source plugin is effectively agnostic to anything. It can be local markdown files, it can be remote CMS like WordPress or Contentful. And at the end of the day, what happens is that when you use these source plugins and you wire them up to fetch data from somewhere, this data gets morphed into a node. This node is then queryable with GraphQL, and this is queryable at build time, not at runtime. So there's no runtime cost to this. This is offloading the cost to the server, offloading the cost to the build process, offloading the cost to the continuous deployment solution. And so when we talked about static rendering and ahead of time compilation, what happens is that pages pluck data from this GraphQL schema, this quote unquote content mesh, this basically mesh of data from disparate data sources. Could be Contentful, could be local markdown files for your developers, could be a YAML file for configuration. It's morphed and merged into this unified GraphQL schema, and then React components as pages pluck just what they need, no more, no less, to build out your application. And so Gatsby can track these pages data dependencies. So because we use GraphQL, because we use this mesh of data, we know what pages, what templates depend upon which items of data, and then we can diff and just rebuild the ones where there have been data changes. And so when this data does change, when this content mesh is seeded with, for instance, a new blog post or a new press release or a title change, when data changes, because we own this data layer, because GraphQL gives us this affordance, we know which pages need to be rebuilt incrementally. So we're not rebuilding out your entire application. We are just building out the minimal amount of the changes to make your application consistent and deliver that end user value of quicker builds more quickly. And so what this looks like, again, with a nice little workflow diagram, is there is a data update. This is a push, a push to your remote schema, a push to your potentially even Git repo. We then diff because it's like we know where the state of the world was previously via caching and storing of remote state. And so we know what needs to change. And so it's like, for instance, I changed the title on a blog post. This blog post data is necessary for this page. We'll just build out this page, and then we'll deploy just this file or just these files for this one page to a CDN rather than the entire blob of a bucket. And so it's kind of three things. It's incremental data fetching, it's diffing. This is effectively the incremental builds process, and then it's deploying incrementally just what needs to change. So the workflow here is push to CMS. Gatsby Cloud pulls data. Remember, push versus pull. Pages are rebuilt, deploy to CDN, and you profit. So by virtue of using static assets, whole types of issues go away, notably issues of scale and also issues of spend. And so you can save money for yourself, for your department, for your team by producing static assets. And you can use a tool like Gatsby Cloud and Gatsby to incrementally build and deploy and not have to wait 20, 30, 40 minutes for your entire build to complete to reach consistency. So one quick question that we kind of talked through at the beginning, like, is this the same thing as using the incremental builds flag, which exists in the open source product? And the answer to this is like unequivocally no. And so we are, well, yes, but actually no. In some sense, that is a kind of incremental build, but it's not a truly incremental build like we're able to deliver in Gatsby Cloud, primarily because as I define an incremental build, it's a sub 10-second build where we are keeping around the remote state, we are keeping around dependencies, we're keeping around the state of the world so that when a data change comes in, we just diff that data and just deploy what needs to change, but we don't have to do any other work. That's quite literally the only work that we're doing. And so if you compare it with other continuous deployment solutions, even with this flag, you'll still need to reinstall dependencies. You'll still need to pull down this cache from the remote state. You'll still need to persist. You actually can't do this. Persist the CMS state and then persist this cache work. And ultimately, this is not true incremental builds. This is not incremental builds in Gatsby Cloud. So let me show and not merely tell. I've been doing a lot of talking. I haven't been doing a lot of showing. So I want to kind of prove to you why this is so appealing. And so I'll do this with two demos. My first demo, I want to show the kind of first time user experience of using Gatsby Cloud. And so for this demo, I've already created a Gatsby Cloud demo site. And so I want to show how easy it is to wire this up with the CMS like Contentful. I want to show what it's actually doing behind the scenes to like wire up the CMS. And then ultimately, I do want to show an incremental build. And then next, I'll show kind of this one more thing approach, which we'll get into that when I'm ready to show it. So first, on the left, this is Contentful, fairly common headless CMS. I used it for my wedding website. That fiance I was referring to is Triplet. We built our wedding website with Gatsby Cloud and then Contentful. So I'll create a new site. In this flow, I already have a Gatsby site, although we also have like an excellent auto provisioning flow where if you don't have a site, it'll create the repo, choose a starter for you, choose a backing CMS, and Gatsby Cloud will do the rest of the work. But I don't want to go through that flow for this. So I will select my organization. I will select maggieanddustin.com. So this is a repo, open source, feel free to check it out. This is a monorepo, so I'm setting the base directory to be the subfolder within this repo that's actually going to be deployed. We'll automatically detect which integration we want to use here. So we detected that this site's using Contentful, so I'll use Contentful. I will authorize. Oops. Pop-ups are fun. Where did this window go? All right. We'll use this wedding and blog Contentful space. And now I'll show what this actually has done while I'm building this out. So I'll set up my site, I'll create my site, and my first build has been triggered. So let me first get my windows back in order. Tile to the right, tile to the left. I like this kind of side-by-side workflow. So what this is going to do now is this is the very first build. This build is not incremental because we have to keep the state of the world around for a build to be incremental. And to keep the state of the world around, we have to first create the world. We have to install dependencies. We have to set up our cache. We have to optimize all of our image thumbnails so that, and then all of this work, all of this heavy work, oftentimes, which is some of the most burdensome part of a build, this will be short-circuited every build thereafter. So I want to show while this is building what we actually did with Contentful automatically without me having to write like a single line of code or do anything manually. So we can go here and we can look at our APIs. So in Contentful, they have this notion of APIs where there's content delivery and preview tokens. So without needing to be intimately familiar with what this is doing, what this has enabled is this has configured Contentful automatically to expose API keys. We passed those API keys as environment variables to this site. And then we've also set up our preview environment so that we can preview our changes instantaneously with our preview tool, which I haven't talked about as much. Conversely, it has also set up some webhooks so that when I push content, when I publish a Contentful instance, it's going to then post to this Gatsby publish webhook. This publish webhook is what's really truly setting up incremental builds here. So this is, the kind of flow again is CMS Contentful is pushing. It's pushing this update to Gatsby Cloud. Gatsby Cloud, because it's this notion of basically, I know where we last were, I know what the state of the world is going to pull this update, pull just what needs to change incrementally, and then build out this Gatsby application. So we can see here, we're installing project dependencies. The project does have quite a lot, and we are now just getting up and running to where we can start seeing some more logs and we can start building out our Gatsby application. While I'm doing this, I can talk a little bit about the content model. This is a fairly simple Contentful site, but it actually is quite image heavy. And so I have around 1,000 images or so. And so with Gatsby Cloud, this takes just a few minutes to build. And the why of that is because we offload this heavy work. One of the more heavier pieces is this generation of responsive image thumbnails. We offload it to cloud workers so that we can short circuit that work and that we can offload it off of the single threaded node process. So for instance, you see all of these photos. All of these photos are like quite large and contentful, but with Gatsby Cloud, again, because it is an app framework, we optimize, we compile, and we only ship what this kind of like the smallest optimized version of your application is for your end users. So you can see what's going on here. It's currently generating image thumbnails. It'll generate around 1,000 plus image thumbnails. And then what I'm going to be doing in this demo, as this build completes, I'm going to just do a quite simple change. I'll change the title from engagement photos to photos of the engagement. So you see here, it's generated nearly 1,000 images, and it did so like pretty quickly. And then now it's building out the static HTML for pages. And in just a second, we can see our link to our deploy preview. Okay, it's going to be uploading to Gatsby Cloud in just a second. All right, we'll take a look so we can compare and contrast when we have a truly incremental build. So here's the wedding website, date TBD. All of these photos are optimized with that image optimization I was referring to in Gatsby Cloud, and we did so with about 1,000 images. So what I'm going to be changing is this engagement photos is just going to be changed to photos of the engagement so we can see our first truly incremental build. So let's go back here. We'll change engagement photos to photos of the engagement. Those words are hard. We will publish, we will push this change to the remote CMS, and Gatsby Cloud will pull this data incrementally. And so you can see here, it's already begun. We're rebuilding just what needs to be rebuilt, and in just under 7 seconds, we have then built out our site. So photos of the engagement, because this gallery is only used on the homepage, because we were able to detect and diff what needs to change, only this page was built. And so our whole application is consistent with our remote state of the CMS, but we did the minimal amount of work here to reach consistency. So this is incremental builds with Contentful. We support 6 CMSs today, more incoming. And I want to show one that is currently incoming in very alpha state, but super, super exciting because of how ubiquitous it is. So let me pull up my WordPress demo. So at Gatsby, we have an excellent open source team who's committed to always driving improvements to the entire open source ecosystem, of course, not just cloud. And so we've been working on an updated version of the Gatsby source WordPress plugin, which works with GraphQL. Some great work we've been doing in the WP GraphQL space, both of which and all of which is open source. And so what I want to do is show what this is looking like. So I talked a lot about how incremental builds as a concept enables you to kind of like change the perception of sites that can be built. And so my thought was, well, why don't I actually build a site that actually does this, that actually is a new site, a site that wasn't typically possible with a tool like Gatsby. And so when you think of like what a new site requires, you know, like the kind of content model and the urgency in which posts need to update, it's like, well, hey, let's say we have a breaking news update. So incremental builds launched. And so we'll say the fastest builds in the cloud incrementally with Gatsby and Gatsby Cloud. We'll add a couple categories here so it shows up on the homepage. So we'll add latest news, and then we'll add breaking. Then we'll publish. We'll push to WordPress. WordPress will automatically publish to this webhook. And remember that this is very alpha, so we aren't quite fully happy with the sub 10-second incremental builds. But this is just building out what needs to change to become eventually consistent incrementally. So we can go ahead and look at the logs, and we see what's going on. We've actually already built in 18 seconds. And we see incremental builds launch, breaking news, the fastest builds in the cloud incrementally with Gatsby and Gatsby Cloud. So this is just the beginning of what we're doing with incremental builds. We're committed to always making improvements to both open source and Gatsby Cloud so that builds as a concept become ever faster and ultimately a thing that you don't even have to think about. And so excited to begin to see what people can build with this concept. And I hope that this demo helps share what Gatsby can be used for and what types of sites Gatsby Cloud can build. So here is the Gatsby Times. This repo is fully open source. Share a link after this webinar. Got a nice little light and dark mode. Of course, you can click through. You can see all this content. So just a caveat, this is all from Denver Post, not my content. So copyright to them. So let me go back. And so here's the commitment. Gatsby Cloud incremental builds are the fastest build in any cloud. Go to gatsbyjs.com to try it out. Try for yourself. Don't just trust my demo. Explore, experiment, and see how fast and how seamless incremental builds truly can be. And ultimately, what will you build next? Let us know. Let us know what incremental builds as a concept is enabling you to build, and use the hashtag #BuildWithGatsby to let us know. Thanks for listening.
Great, thanks, Dustin. Really appreciate that. And we've had a lot of questions come in. So now we're going to transition to the Q&A portion. First of all, there are some questions around which CMSs are supported for incremental builds. And so I will answer initially that question, but right now you can use incremental builds with Contentful, Dado CMS, Cosmic, Sanity, Agility, and of course WordPress in alpha referencing the Gatsby source WordPress experimental plugin that Dustin had referenced. One question though specifically, and Dustin, this is for you, what is our timeline for Drupal support?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. So there was just an update in Slack. Drupal is in alpha and I think will soon be ready for like more testing. So there was just an update internally that we're able to get under 10-second builds with Drupal. So we have people working on the Drupal space just like we're working on the WordPress space. So more forthcoming here. Definitely, if you're looking to test, let us know and we can get you some early access to some great work there.
Great, thank you. That's good news for Drupal users. Definitely some questions around why isn't this available in open source, or is there a version of incremental builds available in Gatsby open source?
For sure. So that's two questions. So the first is why, well, I guess I'll answer the second one first. Is this available in open source? Not true incremental builds. So ultimately, our commitment is, as always, is we want people to be building applications more quickly with Gatsby. And so we think that Gatsby Cloud is the best way to build these applications. And when I say it's the best way, what I mean is that we're able to deliver a truly incremental build experience. And so what that means is that slide that I was referring to, where I said, like, you know, is this the same as incremental builds and open source? The answer is no, because that incremental builds requires a cloud infrastructure so that we can like cache, parallelize, and then keep that state of the world around. And so there is a flag, I believe it's an experimental flag that lets you just build out what needs to be built out based upon changes. But by virtue of other systems not able to keep that cache around and not able to like short circuit that heavy work, it won't ever be truly incremental. But ultimately, we want everyone using Gatsby. We want everyone getting the best possible build experience. So if that meets your use case, like more the merrier. But for the truly best experience of building Gatsby applications, we recommend Gatsby Cloud, which has full incremental builds, that sub 10 second mark that we're able to deliver with our dedicated cloud tooling.
Thanks, Dustin. So since there were quite a few questions here, I just want to make sure I, as well as everybody else, understand. So it sounds like you can get a version of incremental builds with open source, but to get the true full functionality, that's only in Gatsby Cloud.
For sure. You can effectively get faster builds by using that flag, but you won't be able to get that sub 10-second build that you get in Gatsby Cloud that I demoed with Contentful.
Mm-hmm. Great. This might be related, but what options are there for self-hosting?
The world. So self-hosting is I talked about like producing static assets, and so static assets are relatively easy to host and deploy. I actually didn't show this flow, but in Gatsby Cloud on the free tier, and we have a very healthy free tier, you can actually deploy to 5, actually 6 hosting integrations, including like S3, including Netlify, Google Cloud, Vercel, formerly Zeit, etc. And so those are great options that we support with Gatsby Cloud on any tier. Outside of Gatsby Cloud, static assets are quite easy to host and deploy. So it depends on like what your infrastructure looks like. A pretty common one is in the AWS space. Maybe you're using a bucket of content. So like something like S3, and then you're putting a CDN like Cloudflare in front of it. CloudFront rather. It just depends on the use case and kind of like what kind of infrastructure you have at your company or on your team. But generally, static assets are really, really easy to host and really, really cheap as well.
Great. And what about Netlify? What's the difference between incremental builds using Netlify versus Gatsby Cloud?
For sure. So that slide that I was talking through on like why we're different is very much the why of why that matters. So ultimately, it's speed. So with Gatsby Cloud, you get true incremental builds, where true incremental builds are defined as sub 10 second. On Netlify, you can get faster builds by using that flag than the default, but you still don't get quite the same experience. And the why of that is because the model is different. We keep around our infrastructure between builds. We don't recreate it on every new build. And so we don't have to reinstall dependencies. We don't have to like reinstall the cache or rehydrate the cache. We keep that stuff around, and we keep it around between builds so that you're just focusing on the data changes, not the, as I kind of analogized it, the creation of the world. So our world persists between builds, whereas with other continuous deployment tools, you have to recreate the world each time, and then you're able to get an incremental build.
Great. And this one is actually a pricing question. How is incremental builds related to real-time edits on the pricing page on Gatsby Cloud?
That's a great question. So any successful build is a real-time edit. And so one incremental build is one real-time edit. And so each branch gets built. So for instance, if you open a pull request for 3 branches, that's 3 builds, many of which could be incremental. So that's 3 RTEs. So the model is actually quite clear. And the nice thing is that you don't get charged for like, usage or build minutes or build credits. It's just a build happened, a build succeeded, that's an RTE. RTE real-time edit.
Great, thanks. A couple more questions about CMSs and support for them. When are we going to see support for content stack?
That's a great question. So I haven't dipped into that space quite as much as I would like. So I know that there's been work ongoing to kind of get content stack working with incremental builds, but I don't have a timeline as to that yet. Just the fact that we are working with the content stack team to deliver that improved source plugin, which is required to incrementally fetch data, therefore unblocking incremental builds.
And then one follow-up is, what about Netlify CMS?
It's a great question. So I wouldn't see Netlify CMS as particularly relevant to like the incremental builds discussion, but I do think incremental builds, or excuse me, I do think Netlify CMS is pretty cool. So the idea is that Netlify CMS enables you to create flat files, so Markdown, YAML, etc. And those flat files would then like open a PR. So that PR is the push. That PR would then create a build. Unfortunately, we don't support code changes today with incremental builds, and so that build would be quicker. Still one of the quickest builds in the cloud. But if it's a push to GitHub, that will not be an incremental build because it's not a data change. And so Netlify CMS, flat files, Markdown, etc., work great with our builds product, but incrementally, you wouldn't quite see that 10-second build today with that workflow.
Okay, this is a good clarifying question. Should we still use CDNs from other platforms like Netlify, or does Gatsby Cloud provide a CDN too?
That's a great question. So our recommendation today is to use a CDN, Netlify being a good CDN. And so what we do is we provide deploy previews so that you can share them with your team. You can use them to like sanity check and see what your site looks like. And then the step I didn't show is that an incremental build can also incrementally deploy to a hosting integration. And so we recommend using a CDN, one of our supported CDNs, like I mentioned, Netlify, S3 with a CDN in front of it, Vercel, etc. And so we do still recommend that you use a CDN to route your traffic around the globe at the edge.
Great. And then a question around pricing for Gatsby Cloud. What is the pricing model?
I would recommend just going to gatsbyjs.com/pricing. Particularly relevant for this audience is that we have a pretty generous free tier, and so you can get using Gatsby Cloud today, see what you like, see what you don't like, use it to build and deploy your applications, and we automatically give you a free 2-week trial to the professional tier, where you can enable and try out incremental builds. So the pricing page explains this in more detail than I'd want to go on and go on the call. So definitely go to gatsbyjs.com, check out the pricing page, and let us know what you think.
Great. And do we support Fastly CDN?
We do support Fastly CDN. I apologize, I did not mention it, but yes, Fastly is one of our supported. We call them hosting integrations, but Fastly is a supported CDN.
Great. And a clarifying question about Netlify. Someone's rephrasing to make sure they understand. It says, is it right to say that the main difference between Gatsby Cloud incremental build and Netlify's build is that Gatsby Cloud doesn't have to pull the whole code base from GitHub?
That's part of it. It is that So when I keep saying the like state of the world is persisted, that is part of the state of the world. So like we're not going to spend time checking out the latest branch to get. It's going to be on that latest branch because that's sort of like our model is more long-lived. Like we're going to keep this thing around until it's no longer needed. And so when we keep quote unquote this thing around, part of it is the remote get state. Part of it is the cache that we've created and persisted between builds. Notably, the cache contains things like images. So if we've already optimized an image, we won't optimize it again. We'll short circuit that work. And so all of this work and assets that are persisted mean that every build thereafter is going to short circuit when it can, not do that heavy or burdensome work, some of which can be a Git repo, particularly if the Git repo is quite large. And then of course, another key thing is that dependencies are kept around. So unless you change your package.json or a lock file, we're going to keep your dependencies persisted between builds. And so each of these things, this persistence layer, this is why incremental builds work best in Gatsby Cloud.
Great. And can you explain how the incremental build flag works again, or is there documentation?
There is documentation. We publicly document how to use this flag. Again, it is experimental. We're still fleshing out like where it doesn't work, where it works best, etc. And so it's documented on the open source gatsbyjs.org. Go check it out. I think if you search incremental builds, you'll find it. And it gives more detail than I can give, in a 1 or 2 minute pithy answer as to how you can use it and how you can get up and running with it.
Okay, great. There's been a few more questions around supporting CMSs, questions about Ghost, Prismic, Sitefinity. So unless, Dustin, you have more details there, I would say we don't have any timeline for those yet, but we're always looking to have more integrations and expand the CMS integrations with Gatsby Cloud, but no timelines to share on those yet, unless you have any additional detail, Dustin.
Just a general note that this is the benefit of our source plugin ecosystem. And so once we get this working, it's available for everyone. And so we're actively working with many of those on that list to get an improved source plugin experience for everyone. And yeah, it's a super exciting time with our super pluggable ecosystem to get more and better integrations, particularly those that work quite well with incremental builds.
Great. Next question is, will the WordPress incremental build process support Gutenberg?
Yes, so I actually intentionally disabled Gutenberg. I'm not the biggest fan, but yeah, it works just fine with Gutenberg. I could have demoed that flow as well. I actually, just before this call, installed a WordPress plugin to get back to the classic editor. But yeah, to the best of my knowledge and with some earlier demos, it works just fine.
Okay, great. And how will the CDN uploads, like to Netlify, for instance, affect the build times?
That's a great question. So I talked about incremental deploys, and that is the mark that we want to hit. So many of our CDNs, our hosting integrations, support that notion. So when you think of like what a deploy is, here's this bucket of content, like just let me know what changed, and that can be quite slow. And then there's the I know what changed, which incremental builds does. So these files were added, these files were deleted, etc. So it's more of like a mutation or like additive. And so the CDNs that support this like additive flow tend to be quite a bit quicker. And so for instance, on my wedding website, I was using Netlify and I was able to deploy or to build incrementally in around 7 seconds. And then I was able to incrementally deploy to Netlify in around 3 seconds. So it depends on the particular CDN integration and what's supported there. But in general, we always try to commit to incremental deploys, just like we try to commit to incremental builds for as many source plugins as possible.
Great. A question on images. Where do I go to find out more about the cloud generation of the images?
That's a great question. Gatsbyjs.com. And then particularly, I believe the top level domain is gatsbyjs.com/builds. You can also just look up, there's an excellent blog post written by our CEO, Kyle Matthews, that's titled like the launch of builds and distributed builds. And that goes into the intricacies of what distributed builds enables, particularly one of the key optimizations being offloading that offloading image optimization and image transformation from the open source project to cloud workers. So those are some great resources to go check out and read further as to what this is actually doing and enabling for you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I love this next question. Now that we have incremental builds available, from your experience, are there any downsides you've come across for choosing a static site over a dynamic site?
Yeah, I think it's very important that we don't advocate a fully silver bullet solution to everything. And we aren't quite ready, for instance, for like building incrementally or building ahead of time something like Twitter or Wikipedia. And so those are at a scale where the build process would, like that first build I mentioned isn't incremental. That first build would be burdensome and may even lead to like out of memory issues. So the kind of sweet spot for Gatsby and Gatsby Cloud applications today is from anywhere from like 10 to like around 150,000 pages or so. And so much larger than that, we're actively currently working on hitting a higher scale. And so, if it's 1 billion pages, that's not quite a great idea to kind of like statically optimize that. The other big use case is when there's like a factorial effect. So for instance, if I want to generate this page in 100 different variants, that can be that, like if you have 100,000 pages generated in 100 different variants, that gets pretty complex pretty quickly. And so there are ways that you can build these statically ahead of time, but it can be a bit burdensome with where we're at for a scale and supporting that scale comfortably today.
Mm-hmm. What about a pricing tier or plan for students that want to use incremental builds?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't received a bunch of requests for this, but we have talked about students and nonprofits potentially getting access to features on like a plan like that. More forthcoming on that. Not comfortable committing to anything yet, but I was a student once and I definitely would not like to pay for things. And so we definitely would like to support that use case going forward.
This one's a specific example in question. If there is a global element like a footer with recent news posts, and one of those global items is updated, will every page still be rebuilt from scratch, or does incremental builds provide a benefit in that scenario?
It does provide a benefit, which is that even though that would invalidate effectively like every page, because we've kept around that cache, I keep talking about this persistence layer, it's still going to be much faster. Now, it's not going to be that sub 10-second build most likely, particularly if your content model is 100,000, 200,000 pages. But yeah, it's a very good point that if you're making changes to like shared elements and that data change would then invalidate the entire application. I would say that tends to be more fringy, like that's not truly the bulk or the majority of the type of updates that come across. Yeah, it's a great point that build wouldn't be truly incremental, where incremental is defined by like sub 10-second builds.
Mm-hmm. Can you use GitLab with Gatsby Cloud?
Yeah, these are like excellent like roadmap questions. So not today, but we have plans to support GitLab soon. So if you would like to get early access and help us test out this integration, please feel free to email us at support or sales@gatsbyjs.com, and we can get in touch to kind of see how far along we are.
Great. And we probably have time for 2 more questions. Is there still a limit to how many pages a Gatsby site could have, such as can you scale to a site with millions of pages?
I talked a little bit about that in the question a few ago. So yes and no. It depends on content complexity. And so like, is it like not all million-page sites are the same as every other million-page site. So if it's a million-page site with like one image, a title, and some content, yeah, that generally seems like something we can support or plan to support very soon. If it's a million-page site where the content model is incredibly complex and each page is querying for 10 other subpages and each of those pages are themselves complex, like it depends on the content complexity. So all pages aren't equal, but generally that is a scale that we are actively moving towards. But if you have a 5 million, 10 million page site, we're not quite there yet.
Mm-hmm. Great. What if you have a change that affects all pages, like in the header, for example?
I think that's the same question as the footer one. So that shared data change would invalidate all pages. So again, the build would still be faster, but it wouldn't be the sub 10-second build because there's just more work that needs to be done. And by invalidating like a shared component, in effect, you're going to need to regenerate all of the pages.
Great. Thank you, Dustin, for answering all of those questions. We got a ton of questions and several more that we weren't able to get to, but we will review those and can look into following up with either another webinar or live stream or a blog post to make sure we get to all your questions. So again, just want to say thank you for everyone for joining us today. If you want to get started using Gatsby Cloud and incremental builds, go to gatsbyjs.com/get-started, and then you can create your account there. So thanks everyone for joining today.